You didn't miss much. Hello everyone, and welcome back to LorePlay Bloodborne, the Old Hunters. I'm Dr. Faust, and here we are in the fishing hamlet. You may remember last episode, we finished up the research hall and the astral clock tower. After exiting the research hall, we encountered the living failures, which were guarding the door to the astral clock tower and, tending to a large lumen wood tree. After defeating the living failures, we proceeded to open the doors and discover Lady Maria of the Astral Clock Tower. Now you may remember that our beggar friend told us that we had to kill Lady Maria in order to discover the true secret of the nightmare. But when we discover her, she's already dead, seemingly having committed suicide. However, as we approached her corpse, she revived and challenged us to a duel, stating that only an honest death could cure us now, and that she understood the secrets of the nightmare and how they whispered and beckoned so sweetly to those who were not privy to them. She also warned us that a corpse was better left well alone. After killing her, we traveled through the face of the Astral Clock Tower and fell here, the fishing hamlet, which is apparently the secret that Maria was truly guarding. So, the obvious influence of this area is H.P. Lovecraft's Shadow over Innsmouth. As you can see, the denizens of the fishing hamlet are fishmen and sharkmen and fish magic casters, like this guy right here. Strangely enough, they only take one hit to kill, but the homing projectiles that they cast are a massive pain in the ass. And as you can see, the fishmen are wielding whaling harpoons, which may or may not play into the state of the village as we see it now. Interestingly enough, one of the other names for this area is the Violated Fishing Hamlet. And as we proceed through the area, we will learn more about why that name is so apt. For those of you unfamiliar with the Shadow over Innsmouth, I would definitely point you to one of my favorite podcasts on the internet. That would be Bonfire Side Chat on duckfeed.tv. I'm going to put a link to them in the description, but it's hosted by two guys, Cole Ross and Gary Butterfield, and they've reviewed all of the Souls games from Demon Souls to Bloodborne, and because they're in an off-season while we wait for Dark Souls 3, they have been doing influential episodes regarding influences on Bloodborne, and because the fishing hamlet is so obviously influenced by the Shadow over Innsmouth, they did an episode on that, which I highly recommend. And here I'm in the middle of what I consider to be the most difficult enemy encounter in the game. The fishmen throwing spears, the fish dog, and the caster. Now, obviously, you would assume that you would just run to the caster in order to take care of its skull attack, but there's a fishman. Fortunately for me, I managed to get by him, but it's a really difficult encounter if you are unaware of all the working parts in said encounter, and I had a little bit of trouble dealing with it. So let's get into the meat of the fishing hamlet proper. Previously, we explored a waterlogged town square with a well that leads down to one of the worst, and by worst I mean difficult, encounters that I've experienced in Bloodborne. Two of the giant sharkmen wielding anchors. One of them hanging from the ceiling, who you can't damage, and one of them roaming around. And they're very, very tough. And they also give you a weapon when you defeat both of them. But before we get into that, we're about to run into our homeless friend.
Who are you? I'm afraid I've made a bunch of things. Oh, I can hear the bell now. The beast-eyed assassin. He's after me. Again. And again. It never ends. Please. I need you to do something. This village is the true secret. Testament to the old sins. It feeds this hunter's nightmare. Please. Bring to an end the horror. So our forefathers sinned. We hunters cannot bear their weight forever. It isn't fair. It just isn't fair.
And so passes Simon the Harrowed, hunter of the Healing Church. Simon was part of a group of hunters that would disguise themselves as beggars in order to sniff out early signs of the scourge. Although the description also says when the time was right, they would find signs of the scourge where there were none. It just goes to show that the corner beggar is not always who he seems. These guys would look for the scourge when it was active or inactive. Needless to say, if people's fears grew large enough that there was a scourge coming on, then the harrowed beggars would report to the upper echelons of the Healing Church that they had discovered the source of it, even if there were none. So, once again, proving that almost everyone in Bloodborne is a scumbag. I don't know Simon's story, but he kind of redeems himself if he were one of the hunters that falsely accused people of Yharnam of harboring the scourge. The question now becomes, why was Simon so interested in discovering the secret of the hunter's nightmare in the first place? I believe that he possibly saw a fair number of his fellow hunters taken by the nightmare and wanted to know the source of it. He found clues and made his way to the hunter's nightmare, where he discovered you, another sane hunter, to help him along on his journey of discovery. Unfortunately, he was beset by the beast-hide hunter who murdered him in the lighthouse cabin. Now, he said that he could hear the bell now, so when was the last time anyone mentioned a bell to us?
Are you a hunter? Well, that's very odd. Do you hear the toll of the bell?
Not only could Simon hear the bell before he died, we now can too. I alluded to this character being a real kind of a son of a bitch in an earlier episode. We're about to have our first encounter with Brador, the church assassin. If he can get stuck from the geometry. I'm not gonna talk too poorly about the AI pathing, because he really gives it to me upon this first encounter. Uh, Brador was in the cell and asked us if we could hear the ring of the bell. If you applied in the affirmative, then he simply scoffed and laughed at you, saying that such pettiness would be your undoing. And if you answered in the negative, he seemed relieved and told you to go back to your hunt in the earlier portions of the Hunter's Nightmare, and that there was nothing here for you ultimately. And he is wielding a weapon unlike anything we've ever seen so far. And he is tough, and that weapon is fast. So, the most interesting aspect about Brador, aside from his garb, is the fact that he didn't actually kill me. Brador never actually leaves his cell to assassinate anyone. Instead, he rings the bell, and those who are aware of the secret of the Healing Church are able to be invaded by a shade of his. A shade that appears in multiple locations, not just the one across the bridge. So, Brador is free to attempt to assassinate as many times as he wants, as long as his physical body remains safe, which changes the perspective of keeping him locked up in the prison beneath the research hall and astral clock tower. Brador is nowhere safer than in his prison cell. So, that's interesting, and an aspect that is truly revealed later on, but I thought I'd spoil that a bit. Because every time you defeat one of his shades, you get a piece of his armor. Incidentally, if you skip combat with his shades, you can eventually find an item that would allow you to gain access to him, and you can kill him, get his weapon, and all the areas where his shades would spawn, simply have his armor pieces left on the floor. But enough of the ancillary stuff. Let's get to the lore around this village. If you recall, before I crossed the bridge, I noticed that there was something on the shore. A rather large, prone creature, and that is the source of all this otherworldly Old One corruption in the fishing hamlet. That is a great one, and it's beached right next to a fishing village. And all the people of the fishing village have turned into horrible barnacle-encrusted fishmen, and seem to be harvesting these slug-like creatures. Where they're coming from, we don't know. However, we're going to find out. But they use them for everything. Seemingly food and fuel. And that seems to be the source of why these once normal people have turned into these fish monsters. And we know well enough at this point that if it has something to do with a Great One, either Bergenworth or the Healing Church are definitely going to be involved. And because this is the past, it is Bergenworth whom are the scumbags for this portion of the story. They came to the fishing hamlet looking for anything relating to the Great Ones, I'm assuming, because word got out that this fishing town had this large creature on the beach and its citizens had been changed. We have lightning casters right here, and we have the generally aggressive fishmen. And we're going to reacquaint ourselves with a citizen of the fishing hamlet whom we met very, very early on in the DLC. One thing of note that I've always found interesting about the area is the fact that the structures in the village proper, the square area that was flooded earlier, have been abandoned, and it seems that the majority of the citizens live in this cave and in a makeshift village closer to the shore. I think it's interesting that as they've possibly progressed through this mutation by being so close to a great old one, that they have abandoned any formality of human life and have resorted to living in this hatchery, it would seem, and guarding it with their lives. One of the questions that you might be asking is who caused the curse? The village itself, the violated fishing hamlet, Bergenworth came there and took the citizens and scraped the inside of their skulls looking for internal eyes. So you may think that it was the citizens, or if we take into account that there is a dead great one on the shore, then it may in fact be that being that has caused the curse. I have a another theory that the curse is associated with something else that that being is attached to that we will discuss a little later on. But the knowledge that Bergenworth gained from this trip to the fishing hamlet began their research into the Eternal Eyes, which takes us back to the research hall, where the Healing Church, once again descended from Bergenworth, decided that they would have prisoners and citizens and even their own members take in water into their heads in order to possibly produce these internal eyes, which some may recall Willem was ultimately fascinated with, to the point that he really disliked the use of blood as a medium for ascension. Another interesting point of discussion is the relationship of the fishing hamlet to Lady Maria. Last episode, we battled her and learned that the village was the true secret that the Healing Church was trying to hide. You may recall that I mentioned that there are two very tough sharkmen down the well. And when you kill them, they drop a weapon. That weapon is Lady Maria's. It says in its description, to paraphrase, that Lady Maria was so disgusted with the actions that she had performed in the fishing hamlet that she cast her weapon into a dark well, never to take it up again. Another interesting aspect of the description is that the weapon itself says that Lady Maria actually abhorred the blood arts and took on a weapon that did not require the use of blood whatsoever, which when we fight her, she has become a little lax on. But enough about Maria for right now. Let's talk about the new enemy type that we are currently facing. Those of you with keen eyes who have been watching this entire LP will recall that we encountered one of these snail women all the way back in the Hunter's Nightmare when she fell out of the sky, which now, given the location of the secret of the nightmare, makes perfect sense, because the fishing hamlet is simply right above the Hunter's Nightmare. Now, I do have a theory on the Great One on the beach and how it may pertain to the snail woman that we encountered earlier on. I'm going to spoil a bit and let you all know, in case you weren't well aware, that the Great One on the beach is Kaz. Now, you may recall Mikolash in the Nightmare of Menses mentions Kaz, and Kaz causing Rom the Vacuous Spider's ascension. The interesting part about that is that Kaz is actually dead. So, I believe that Mikolash stating that Kaz caused Rom's ascension was more of a metaphorical sense, most likely to indicate that the knowledge that Bergenworth gained from their expedition to the fishing hamlet allowed the creation of their own Great One, Rom, the Vacuous Spider. So, due to this, Bergenworth and ultimately the Healing Church linked the Great Ones initially with the ocean, which I believe may in fact be incorrect. The snail woman that fell into the hunter's nightmare, I think, probably reenacted what happened to Kaz herself, in that she actually fell out of the cosmos into the ocean and possibly died upon impact, or was severely injured and eventually washed ashore as Flotsam and Jetsam, where the residents of the fishing hamlet discovered her and began harvesting the slugs from her body. These are actually referred to as cause parasites. I believe that Cause's death may have actually poisoned the waters around the fishing hamlet and reduced the fish population. So the residents of the fishing hamlet began feeding off of these cause parasites and also raising them as their own. Now, the interesting aspect of the cause parasites is that they are in fact phantasms, which once again ties into the research hall because the lumen wood was what was used to raise phantasms for the Healing Church. Another interesting aspect, I think, is that earlier in the level, we discovered a gravestone with a lumen wood flower on it. I believe that gravestone was placed there by Maria along with the lumen wood flower. And there are other theories about how Kaz died. Some would say, some like to think that the citizens of the fishing hamlet killed her. The spears that they wield are most commonly used in whaling, and that they may have accidentally killed Kaz. I don't think that that is true, simply because of the hunter's nightmare. The curse was placed upon Bergenworth for desecrating the fishing village, and so if the citizens of the village had in fact murdered Kaz, I don't think that she would have allowed them to curse Bergenworth and by virtue curse the hunters and the entire line of hunters from the first all the way down to us if they had hunted her. Some people think that Bergenworth may have killed Kaz, and that doesn't seem to hold a lot of water with me, only because there is nothing that Bergenworth would want more than to get their hands on a living Great One. With all that being said, I think that the Hunter's Nightmare and ultimately the Hunter's Curse recontextualizes a lot of how the Hunter's Dream actually functions. The Hunter's Nightmare will inevitably take hunters that become drunk with bloodlust. However, that is something that never happens to the player character, because they are in fact protected by the Hunter's Dream. I believe that hunters that are tied to the Hunter's Dream are in fact incapable of being transported to the Hunter's Nightmare, and will in fact resurrect to the hunter's dream if ever drawn into the hunter's nightmare due to bloodlust. Which in my mind means that Lawrence and Gurman conducted the ritual to beckon the moon presence for the hunter's dream as a means of protecting the hunters from becoming victims of the hunter's nightmare. And I believe that served the purpose for Lawrence twofold, because towards the end of his life, at least I believe, I think that Lawrence realized that it was impossible for a being to ascend without both consuming blood and growing eyes on the inside or gaining insight. So, Lawrence created the hunter's dream and left Gurman as the host of it as a means of finding a hunter that would grow powerful enough to actually ascend to a great one, which is what happens in one of the 3 endings of the game. The old hunters also recontextualize Gurman's relationship with the doll. Now that we've met Lady Maria, we can understand why Gurman is so dismissive and seemingly reviles the doll, seeing as though she looks exactly like Lady Maria and sounds like her, but her personality is not like hers at all. She's doting and parental and has a little bit of the ennui, and she is passive. She's not aggressive like Maria, and that, I think, drove Gurman into a level of despair that he never came out of. So he can only see the doll with contempt because she is this passive joke in his mind of what Maria actually was. And as we draw to the end of this episode, I also wanted to talk about Brador a little more. The most interesting aspect about Brador is that, the 2 most interesting aspects are his weapon and his headdress, which is the scalp of a cleric beast. The more interesting aspect, I feel, of Branor is that his clothes are simply bloody versions of the foreign set. And those who have played the game know that the foreign set is the first bit of clothing that you start off with when you first start the game, which seems to indicate that Brador, much like you, was a foreigner who came to Yharnam for some reason. It also explains that Brador and a friend of his came to Yharnam, and that his friend became a cleric beast and died. I want to thank everyone for joining me yet again for another episode of LorePlay Bloodborne the Old Hunters, and once again I will point you to Bonfireside Chat at duckfeed.tv. Fantastic podcast for all of your souls and Bloodborne needs. And this is Dr. Faust saying once again, if at first you don't succeed, die again.